I really do not enjoy commercials for cleaning products. I never know what to do with them. They're kind of ridiculous. Like a laundry detergent commercial might take like two white shirts and throw them to two cute puppies who are rolling around in mud for like 5 minutes, and they put in the washer, and suddenly the one shirt's completely clean, the other one's still dirty. It's like, I don't know whether or not to believe that. And they'll say something like, it's like magic. The shirt's just magically clean. And I kind of doubt that. Well, I was in Target a little while ago, and I came across something that it didn't even try to give you any sort of science behind what it was doing whatsoever. It just, in the name of the product, it called itself the Magic Eraser. That's just what it calls itself. I don't know if you know these things. They're these little spongy-like things that they just call what am I supposed to do with something that says magic in the title? Am I really supposed to buy that this is magic that's going to clean my surfaces? We are in John chapter 9 today. And this is kind of the question that's on the table. Is Jesus really who he says he is? This is really the question throughout the entire book of John, but it's still very much there. Because people are kind of wondering, with everything that we've seen, can we still believe Jesus when he makes claims as big as suggesting that he is the Messiah? Can we believe that? Now, we've been following this story for quite some time, so I'll take you back to a few of the chapters that have just recently happened. In chapter 5, Jesus healed a paralytic man, which seems like it would be a great thing, but the problem for Jesus was that he did it on the Sabbath. And so by doing it on the Sabbath, the Pharisees and the religious leaders were trying to use that as evidence that Jesus was breaking the law. And to make matters worse, the paralytic guy who got healed, he kind of turned Jesus over to the authorities. And he kind of said, here's the man, what are you going to do with him, essentially? And so in chapter 6, Jesus, who's still trying to kind of dodge some of these accusations about being a lawbreaker, he ends up feeding a lot of people out of 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It's a miracle that people love because they get food out of it. But once he starts teaching about Jesus being the one who sustains us, well, a lot of people couldn't absorb that teaching, and he started to lose some followers. In chapters 7 and 8, you see Jesus being grilled, essentially, by normal people, religious leaders, pretty much everybody. They want to understand, is this really the Messiah? Can Jesus really be who he says he is? And they start asking him all these questions based on what they thought the Messiah would ultimately be like and how he would function in the world. And Jesus just kind of doesn't answer their questions quite the way that they are expecting because he's pointing to something bigger. Now, we took 2 weeks off here, 2 weeks to kind of rearrange things. 2 weeks ago, we looked at kind of what God is doing globally through some of the people that we support in this church. And last week, we actually jumped ahead to John chapter 10. So this morning, we're going to fill in the gap between John chapter 8 and John chapter 10. The problem is, John chapter 9 is one long story that can't really be broken into smaller pieces. And it's 41 verses long. So we have 41 verses in front of us, which means with about the time that we have to do this message, we're going to be traveling about 1.3 verses per minute, VPMs. And anything over 1 VPM is really fast, and so it means you have to lose a lot of detail in the process, and so that's going to happen this morning. But we're going to see what we can do with that. Go ahead and turn to John chapter 9. But before we get into it, I actually want to look at Job, the book of Job. It's on page 350 or so if you're using a Bible in front of you, but you can stay in John chapter 9 if you want. We're not going to look very far into it. The whole book of Job is basically one thing. You've got this guy, his name is Job, and he's doing pretty well, and then God allows some bad things to happen into his life. And so Job, as he is kind of dealing with the loss and pain that he's experienced, he's calling upon some of his friends to come and surround him. Now, his friends are convinced that the reason that Job is experiencing the misery that he is experiencing is simply because Job has some sort of sin in his life. He has done something to offend God. And although he may seem to be a righteous person on the outside, there must be something inconsistent about his life that is causing God to bring about these things in him. And all of his friends kind of say this, and Job kind of says, I show me what it is, show me what I've done, but they can't really, because Job really hasn't done anything. This was simply something that God allowed to happen. And this discourse kind of runs through most of the book before God finally vindicates Job and kind of lays into his friends a little bit. So Job is a book that shows us something that we don't always like, and that's simply that sometimes God does things and we don't quite know why. We know that God ultimately is a just God and a righteous God, and that's what the people in Jesus' time believed. In fact, that's what set apart their God from a lot of the other gods in the area, a lot of the other deities that you might choose to worship. A lot of the other gods, they seem petty and trite. They got revenge for no good reason. But the God of the Israelites, well, this was a God who focused on justice and righteousness, and this was very important to them. And they were right. That is how our God functions. On the grand scale, as he works throughout this world and throughout history, he is a God of justice and righteousness. But in any one particular moment, in any one particular event, it might just be beyond us to fully understand what God is doing in the moment. And that's what we're going to see at the start of John chapter 9. So starting in verse 1, it says this: As he went along, Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? The disciples, they asked a pretty standard question. This was one of those sort of philosophical debates about the law that people would often ask, is that if you had someone who was born with some kind of an affliction, what was the reason? Obviously, there was sin somewhere. Who was responsible? Was it the parents? Was it something about sin before birth for this guy, or predictive of how his life was going to be? That was the kind of debate that existed. And so the disciples were asking a question that was pretty common. Is it this guy's fault, or was it something that his family did before him? Either way, there's going to be shame involved in this guy's life. Because even if really the blame should fall on the parents, it still kind of puts him in this place where his family was sort of outcasted in some sense. They were seen as sinners. They had to be. This blindness wouldn't have shown up if it wasn't for some sort of sin on the part of this man or his family. That was the underlying assumption. So coupled with the fact that the guy couldn't see and had to beg for a living, he really didn't have much of a place in his society. He was seen as covered in shame and not of use to anybody. The disciples probably didn't in their minds have this idea that they were trying to help the guy. They just wanted to know, what's going on here? What's happening? And they were asking it using all the basic presumptions of their time. But Jesus, he responds in such a way that kind of reminds us a little bit of Job. That sometimes God does things and we don't fully understand it all. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Jesus responds in a way that probably wasn't completely satisfactory to the disciples. He kind of challenged their presumptions and answered it with this third option that wasn't even on the table, as he so often does. That God, although he is just and righteous, there are times where we're going to look at certain situations and not really be able to understand what God is thinking. And you know what? That's okay, because God's a little bit bigger than we are. But it's still going to perplex us at times. And so Jesus, he's telling them that while I'm with you, some pretty incredible things are going to happen. And at some point in time, I'm going to leave. And some things are still going to be pretty incredible that are going to happen. They're going to happen through you. And Jesus, he's warning them that this time is with him is limited. But what they're going to see over and over again is God's going to show up even in the midst of odd, unknowable circumstances and do something pretty impressive. Thus, Jesus bends down and begins to create mud. Now, the disciples probably could have guessed at this point that Jesus was about to do something that was going to be a little bit revolutionary. And they would be right. See, if you follow the book of John, Jesus is progressively doing miracles that increase in magnitude and increase in meaning. This is something he's been doing throughout the entire book. But Jesus' miracles are going to get bigger and bigger, and they're going to become more profound. The miracles are not simply going to solve somebody's physical problem, but they're going to point to spiritual realities that could change people's lives. And this is no exception. Although it will not be the biggest one, which we'll get to in future weeks. Go, he told him, wash the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Jesus covers this man's eyes in mud, He goes to a pool, washes it, and now he can see. There's fantastic imagery right here about the creation of humanity out of dirt. But again, 1.3 VPMs, we're going to skip over that. So, what I want to focus on is this. Curing a blind man, born blind, was seen as something that was impossible. And we'll get to that later in this passage. That's something that they kind of all understood. That's just not something that you do. There are other people who might claim to be healers or miracle workers, maybe have claimed to have some point in time healed someone who was blind but wasn't born that way. This was unheard of. You don't cure a blind man. And actually, we know that it's actually pretty difficult. So Kristen's brother works for a company that tries to restore sight to blind people. Most of their products have to do with people who have lost their sight at some point in their life. That's sort of the easiest place to start. But her brother was telling me that they've actually had technology for quite some time where you can kind of still help someone, even if they were born blind, to see just a little bit. It's a very odd way of seeing things, but they can do that just a little bit. And so you kind of get hooked up in this machine, almost like you're plugged into the Matrix or something, and they can kind of, through a computer, stimulate parts of your brains to help you see. He said one of the first people to do this, though, when they did it, person born blind, had never seen anything in his or her life, one of the first people to do it, as soon as they flipped on the machine, the experience was so far outside of anything that was comfortable that the person immediately yelled, "Shut it off!" Because it was just completely outside of what they understood. In fact, there's a good chance that the part of our brain that focuses on sight, if it's unused for your entire life, it begins to focus on other things. And so who even knows what this person experienced? It was just remarkable, but more than they could comprehend at the moment. And so Jesus, doing this thing where he's healing a man born blind, there is something major happening in him, things that we don't really get to understand. We don't really know how he felt the moment that he could see. We don't get that. But we have to imagine that his life probably started to look pretty different at that point. That he thought, maybe this is going to start to change things. I can actually be part of this society again. I can do something useful with my life. And even if people label me or my family a sinner, at least I have my sight now. That's something. But he wasn't the only one who noticed. There were other people who did, particularly everyone who'd seen him begging all around town. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. I had mud, I washed off the mud, I could see." That's what he's got. Like that's all he has to answer that, right? "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought so this guy, unlike the paralytic in chapter 5, who immediately went to the authorities and told them about Jesus, this guy never actually went to go look for Jesus or really had anything to do with him at that point in time. He had his sight. He was enjoying his sight. He didn't know what it all meant, but he wasn't turning Jesus in right away. There was something about Jesus I think piqued his curiosity. I mean, it was a name that he had heard before, a name that carried a lot of weight, and if you were going to say Jesus was the Messiah, you'd get kicked out of the synagogue, so he knew about that. Now he's the guy who healed his eyes. Well, that's interesting, and that's worth pondering. A little bit mysterious, but worth pondering. Other people thought, though, that it was worth bringing this to the attention of the authorities, so they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Now, this isn't in the Bible. I have to imagine that at some point, Jesus' disciples took him aside and said, "Look, we know you're amazing. It's great that you heal people. We even follow your teachings when all these other people haven't. That's all true. But it would just make our lives a lot easier if you would stop healing people on the Sabbath. Any other day of the week. Any other day." As soon as you bring in the Sabbath, it tends to get the religious authorities riled up a little bit. He's not supposed to do that. He's not supposed to make mud or heal people on the Sabbath. So they said. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Mud, wash, sight. That's what I've got for you. This is the process. This is what happened. Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. No one can make sense of what's happening. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." Our formerly blind man has a little bit of a progression going on here. First, he knew Jesus by name and reputation only, and then he knew Jesus as the person who healed his eyes. And now he's going to say, whatever happened there is unique enough. This man's from God in some way. He's a prophet. He stops shy of using the M word. You don't want to use Messiah right now because the religious leaders really don't like that. But he's going to say prophet. This is a prophet, someone God sent. He's doing something that only someone from God could do. This wasn't exactly the answer the religious leaders want to hear. So they're going to bring in somebody else to kind of help mitigate the situation. They're going to see if they can use these people to help with the facts. And so they're going to bring in the parents. Now, this is interesting because if you remember in verse 2, when the disciples ask the question, why is this man blind? Is it because of him or is it because of the parents? These parents now are called in for questioning. So they get to be part of the fun. They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son, they asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? We know he is our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. They kind of pass the buck. And there's a lot of reasons for it. This is kind of where we understand this. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That is why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So his parents really don't want to have anything to do with this. So the religious leaders are getting a little bit frustrated at this point in time. See, this formerly blind man and his parents, this is a family who is living in shame. And the shame largely has to do with this blindness. They may not know what the sin is, but because the blindness occurred, this family has some kind of sin among them. And so generally speaking, they wouldn't be called on by religious leaders. That is until the Pharisees thought that they might be able to use them to try to trap Jesus, or at least discredit the story. That's what they were hoping. But the parents were proving useless in this regard. And so they turned back to the only other person they could, and that was our formerly blind man. A second time, they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. Which is funny because they're talking to a blind man that previously they've labeled as a sinner to identify someone else as a sinner. And they want him to do this because even though he's someone they wouldn't normally associate with, they could still use him in this quest to try to discredit or possibly even trap Jesus. If they could just get him to somehow renounce this miracle, it didn't even really matter how. If it was a fabrication or somehow just demean Jesus' character, they could use that. There's something they could do with that. And so now, this guy's kind of in a crisis point. Because he had just had his sight restored. He's maybe finally in a position to have some kind of acceptance in this society, but he's being asked by the religious leaders to denounce Jesus. This is a pickle. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I have told you already and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you too want to become his disciples? It's getting real. See, he's asked again what it is that happened. And he would only have the same response to give them. Mud, washing, sight. That's all he's got. He's not going to repeat himself on this point. It's clear that the religious leaders are looking for something that our formerly blind man just knows he can't offer. Because whatever happened with Jesus was really significant. He doesn't know much about him. He doesn't know his background. But he does know that he was once blind, and now he can see. So, magic eraser. I've lived in a lot of different houses over the last couple of years, and when you rent a lot of different houses, you learn very quickly that every landlord has their own thing, whatever it is. They have their own peculiarity, and you kind of have to cater to that a little bit, and that's okay, that's fine. But there was one particular landlord who had more quirks than some of the rest of them. At one point in time, they asked us to not flush our toilet paper down the toilet, which led me to the question of what then do you... Never mind. So when we were leaving this house, we didn't want to leave any smudges on anything, because anything that was dirty we knew was going to be a big deal. So we were going to clean the house anyway, but we really wanted to make sure that we found some way to wash the walls, which if you've ever tried to wash walls isn't particularly easy. It's a little bit of a challenge. I've YouTubed and Googled different ways to do it. There's really no convenient, easy way to wash walls. You've got to find something. So while I was at Target then, I see this box for Mr. Clean's Magic Eraser, and on the back it says you can use it on walls. So I'm very skeptical because the thing says magic in the name, but nonetheless, I'm out of options. And so I buy 1 pack of 4 magic erasers. I take this home, and I'm not really quite sure how it works, but I read the instructions. It says dab some water on it, and so you put some water on it, and it becomes kind of moist, like a little moist sponge, and just go on the surface that has the issue, and it will disappear, is what it claims. Like, okay, fine. So I go to one part of our house that had a little bit of crayon on it. How the crayon got there, I will never know, but there it was. So there's this crayon on the wall, and I take the wet magic eraser to it, and I start to rub it off, and the crayon disappears. It's totally gone. It's like it was never there in the first place. Who knew? So I go to some of the other smudges, some of the ones that are kind of like the little black marks that are like dust, and start to get those, and yeah, those go away too. And I get to other ones that I thought there's no way, and sure enough, every smudge I attack with this thing just disappears completely. All the meanwhile, this magic eraser, it just starts to evaporate. It doesn't leave it residue. It just gets smaller and smaller, and I don't know where it's going. Eventually you get to the point where you can't hold it anymore, and then you need to go get another one. So I grab another one, I do that with all 4 of them. It's not enough to cover the house, but every spot I touch it's clean. I couldn't believe it. So I'm telling this to my housemates, and they look at me like, you're crazy. You bought a product called a magic eraser. Like, oh, I know. You probably even used it on the Sabbath, didn't you? Like, I don't know. I don't know what this thing is made of. I've tried. I've Googled it. I've looked it up. I've tried to figure out what is in a magic eraser. It is hard. The best I could tell was that it was a science experiment gone funky. Like it was like cleaning materials used in a lab that somehow got in the wrong thing. They realized, oh, this cleans well, and then they boxed up and sold it. So I really don't know what is in this. Now, I really do doubt that it's magic, but it certainly instills quite a bit of wonder in me. I may never understand the magic eraser, but I'm certainly going to keep using it. In future houses, eventually I would go to Target and there would be, magic eraser box on the shelves, but never quite enough. We'd need like 40 of these things to try and get through, and there'd never be quite enough boxes there. So every time I go to the aisle, I'd kind of look around, see if anyone was watching, and I'd just scoop them all up into my cart, which looked really sly until I get to the checkout stand, and the checker's just like, what is this? One of the things that our formerly blind man identified was that there was something about Jesus he didn't understand, but it was highly significant. This is on a much grander scale than my cleaning supply. There's something about Jesus that is mysterious, that is wonderful, that is beyond our comprehension, and it was certainly beyond his. And in this questioning process with the Pharisees, he began to experience a little bit of that wonder. And he realized that based on everything they were telling him, that the Pharisees, they didn't have it figured out. They thought they knew, they thought they understood, they believed that their knowledge or their position could get them through, but really they didn't understand. And our formerly blind man saw that this Jesus, who had healed his eyes, probably knew a lot more than the Pharisees did. And unlike the paralytic man in chapter 5, he wasn't about to throw Jesus under the bus. He was going to let this thing play out. Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. This man were not from God. He could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Again, they just gave him the same status that he had started with. This man was a sinner from birth, be it from him or his family. Sin. And now I don't have to deal with you. You're not useful to me, so get out. And what we understand from this passage is threw him out as essentially an exile. He wasn't welcome back, which essentially means he was thrown out of all of the social functions of the day, which were all tied into the religious structure. This man, who was once an exile for his physical blindness, was now an exile because the religious leaders had made him so. And you have to wonder at this point, was the guy thinking, was this worth it? Was it worth defending Jesus to be exiled? Was this a price I was willing to pay when I don't even really understand all of what is happening here? But Jesus will step in. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" This is another title often used for the Messiah. "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." This man first knew Jesus by name, then knew Jesus to be the one who had healed his sight, then had enough faith to decide that this man was at least a prophet, and now confronted with Jesus for the first time. And remember, he was sent to the pool with the mud on his eyes. We don't know that he ever saw Jesus' face before this actual moment. Confronted with the reality of the Christ, he believes. And not knowing what else to do, he falls down and begins to worship. Because what he has encountered is so far beyond him, he has no other recourse but to acknowledge that's worthy of his worship. That's what he does. Understanding, that was a little bit harder. It was probably very confusing what all was going on. This happened all very quickly, probably. But I like to think that for this man, he probably was one of those guys who, later on, after Jesus would die and be raised from the dead, that he was one of the first people to help begin to spread the message that Jesus was risen. There were a lot of them, and we know that. There weren't just the disciples. I like to think that this was one of those guys. Maybe he wasn't, I don't know. But you got to imagine, for someone who had never seen before, to have someone come in and restore your sight, and then tell you that the things that you really care most about in life can be found in me, well, there's really nothing else left to this guy but Jesus. There's really nothing else that matters. Everything else has been taken away from him. Jesus is what matters. Because as much as he wanted to see, by the end of this passage, what he wants more than that is to understand, what is Messiah? What is this Jesus who can really speak to me on a deeper level than I've ever understood before? And Jesus kind of reveals the game here, that this miracle wasn't just about someone physically being able to see. But this is how we oftentimes function in our world, is that while we might walk around being able to physically see things, we're oftentimes completely blind to the realities that are surrounding us. And Jesus wanted to invite us in to take steps to see those realities in new ways, even in the midst of the mystery. Now, they weren't alone when this happened. There were some Pharisees nearby, so they overheard this. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What, are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." And so this passage will end not with the blind man, but the Pharisees. The people who were staring at the most real thing in existence. They were staring at Jesus. But like someone who had never seen before, plugged into the machine, freaking out, saying, "Shut it off," they just couldn't accept this reality. It was too different from what they knew, too different from their modes of operating, too different from the systems that they had in place, from the status that they had. Whatever their reasons, it was just not going to happen for them because they were clinging to what they knew, to what they saw. And Jesus could invite them to see something more, but they just weren't going to have it. See, this is the interesting thing about faith, is that it runs in this interesting cycle of understanding and mystery. Both things happen at the same time. See, there's a very real sense in which this blind person, he understood a lot more of who Jesus was just in these 41 verses, from a name only to someone who had healed him to a prophet to the Messiah. He had a lot of increasing understanding of who Jesus was. But every step along the way just created a whole lot more mystery. Because every time you understand more of who Jesus is and more of what God is up to, the mystery becomes bigger and grander. All of the questions don't get answered. In fact, more questions start to arise. And this is the give and take that often happens in faith. That as we continue to dive into our relationship with Jesus, we understand more, but we have a lot more questions because God is that big. And the mystery continues to unfold before us. And sometimes that drives us absolutely nuts because we want to understand it all. We're just not going to. That's not in the cards. But we do know that Jesus is calling us into deeper and deeper faith. And as we do that, we step into more of what God is doing. We see more of his presence in the world. We see that he is up to something incredible and that we get to be a part of it. We have enough understanding to keep moving in faith and embrace some of the mystery. So that's my hope for us this morning, that wherever we are, whatever is happening, and sometimes what's happening is not particularly pleasant. Sometimes the particulars of our lives look a little bit like Job or like this man at the beginning, this particular that just seems really hard, something that's just not going right. Maybe that's what's happening with us. Even though God is at work in the world, something isn't quite right in our lives. That happens a lot. Maybe everything is going well. I don't know. But whatever is happening, God is calling us to move forward in faith. And as we do that, we get to see a little bit more of the mystery that causes us to fall more in love with him every day. Let's pray. God, I thank you for this story. I thank you for the story of the blind man who saw not just with his eyes, but began to see what you were really doing in the world, because that is us, God. Every day we come back to you and say, show us more. Open our eyes more to what you are doing. So we will never understand fully everything that you're up to. We can't. But God, we pray that we get to be part of all this with you, that we are grateful that you have invited us into this relationship with you. God, every day show us more. Help us to understand your love in an increasing measure and to show that love to the people around us. In your name we pray.